I wanted to hear your thoughts on that Gestalt paper, honestly. And I guess what I've been thinking about is that the necessity of language.
Mm.
Like, how necessary is it to basically think about things that aren't necessarily language based with
Mm.
language? Like, have, you know, when they talk about uh, originally science needed to point to a truth, to me, what that it takes like a religious tone in a certain sense where there's something that's beyond language that in a certain formatted language, you arrive to a certain place that points to something that's beyond language. And then you get to this whole nonlinear dimension. So I just was wondering how necessary uh, the linear dimension is for there to be a nonlinear dimension. And then, yeah, the Gestalt paper. But
That's an excellent question, Chetan. Good to see you, my friend. And no, what I understood of the paper, Mr. Jockin, how are you doing today, sir? Good to see you, Thomas. How are you doing, Mr. Jockin?
Great. Doing great. Having a great summertime reading a certain special book.
Well, you are very kind, Thomas. Thank you, sir.
You're a great author. It's been a pleasure reading it.
Well, thank you, Thomas. I appreciate it as well. And yeah, we actually had it. It was funny. We had our anniversary yesterday, and I was looking at some of the pictures from nine years, and I was like, we look like babies, like children. I was like, oh my gosh, our cheeks are like so. I was like, oh my gosh, in different things. But it was funny because one of the pictures I was looking at was next to belonging again. So you made me think of that. And it's funny how the years go by. But thank you, Mr. Jock, and I appreciate it very much. But like fine wine. Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate it. That's very good. But Mr. Luber was just asking, he sent me a fascinating paper on computer science and the concept of Gestalt. Which is always a funny word to say, and if I mispronounce it, please forgive. And as we all know, that notion is the idea that when you look at something, you know that there's something more than the parts. Like when I look at the bookcase, for example, I just visually know that bookcase, there's parts, but it's not just parts, right? Like the gestalt of it all comes out all at once. And what's so interesting is what that computer scientist was talking about, is how if you're going to be doing, as I understand, like visual artificial intelligence, then the concept of gestalt is necessary. You know, the computer, the AI is just going to have a sense of gestalt, the ability to identify things. And what is really interesting, I've increasingly become interested in the way that artificial intelligence functions as a kind of mirror back on us. Like when I think about artificial intelligence, Mr. Rivera, good to see you, my friend. Like, you know, so for example, like when I think about artificial intelligence as pure calculation, it's interesting how it reflects back on when you go, well, how much of human civilization has erected and designed itself on a notion of intelligence that's pure calculation? Maybe we should fix that. Maybe we should change that. And it's kind of interesting, almost the meta reflection that I keep feeling about with artificial intelligence and that topic, like how it makes us reflect on the concepts of intelligence we may have that we never questioned as a society. I mean, obviously, we, in the work that we do, we talk about that. But just as now society as a whole is saying, well, what is intelligence? And why did we define intelligence purely in terms of calculations? Is there something more of that? So there's kind of an interesting meta conversation that everyone is kind of thrown into by AI. But the point is, what's so remarkable in that paper I read, Mr. Luber, is just the idea of how much the human automatically gets gestalt without even thinking about it. It's like the framing problem in AI, where I just know that in the next frame of space-time, there is not suddenly going to be a lion next to me. You know, there would have to be the door open and the lion comes and then sits next to me in the process of the lion be there. I just know and can calculate from all of the infinite possibilities of the next frame of space-time that one of those just is not going to be a lion appearing next to me, right? Like I could theoretically take a movie reel, or clip and pull out some clips and add a clip and put them together and suddenly there's a lion next to me, but you can't do that in reality, right? Like, and you as a human being just kind of know that. Well, I'm just amazed, like Dr. Robinson was talking about, how big of a problem that is for AI. For it to be able to have really successful predictive modeling outside a language model, you've got to overcome the framing problem. So likewise, what he was just pointing out is the question of how would artificial intelligence be able to overcome the Gestalt problem, a sense of the whole without having to calculate the existence of a whole every single time it sees parts. Because like when I look at the bookcase, and this would actually speak to something Mr. Rivera was saying on distinction, when I look at the bookcase, I know the bookcase is not part of the wall. I know it's not part of the pictures. I know it's not part of the ceiling. I know that the whole of the bookcase does not include the wall. But isn't it kind of wild that you just kind of know that, right? Like, you know that the handles, the glass, the shelves, they all make a Gestalt, but that Gestalt is distinct from the wall, from the house. And yet I know the house, the wall is part of the Gestalt of the roof, right? And the house, right? So it's just very interesting how the human is able to immediately know what things go together as wholes and what things don't go together as wholes, and that you actually apprehend that instantly more than calculate it, right? Like I don't just like calculate, oh, where does the bookcase end and where does the wall begin? I just know it, right? And that's pretty wild because, like, if that is, in some respects, and then I'll pass it to who wants to speak, but I, in response to the paper, some of the things it made me think about, like, basically artificial intelligence to start moving beyond calculation would have to be capable of that ability of Gestalt and defining Gestalts apart from one another. Now, I know the word Gestalt is used in many ways in different ways, but what I understood what he was talking about in that paper is that ability to grasp a pattern of a whole from parts and to know that the parts also operate together as that whole, and then to automatically apprehend all the different Gestalts all around you and which ones begin and which ones end. And basically, without that capacity, intelligence is impossible. Without that, like, autonomous intelligence of the human being is impossible without that ability. All you could ever have is calculation, but we as human beings, by already having that ability, can just input it to the artificial and it can go straight to the calculation and overcomes the problem, right? But if you wanted to go beyond that to something more like artificial intelligence as opposed to a language model, which I understand is a slice of deep learning, which I understand is a slice of artificial intelligence, you would need to be able to do that. And I think the paper, as I understood it, was proposing that actually the information to be capable of Gestalt might actually be located in every single phenomenon. Like, you don't actually, like, you can, the whole and the parts actually would go together, right, into this, like, the same time. So you could overcome that processing problem. But those were some of the things. So those were some of my initial impressions of the paper. But let me give it to you, Mr. Luber, and Mr. Kashir. It is good to see you, sir. I hope you are doing well. And Mr. Luber.
Yeah, I still need to read that paper, but I mean, I have an understanding of Gestalt just like through Heidegger and just through Google researching what Gestalt is. And I just wanted to make a comment. It seems like what's interesting about the human condition is that we start in that Gestalt, and what we've done from that point is kind of regress or break into parts what that Gestalt is, then to only realize that the importance, the actual like kernel, if you will, is that Gestalt. So it makes me think, then does the breaking down into parts, the math, the computation, the language, is that necessary in order to even understand the importance of Gestalt or even to see the Gestalt? And like, if that is the case, that seems really like paradoxical. Like, that seems like really counterintuitive in a certain sense. So I just was wondering, like, is there a way, like, I can't think of a way that you can understand Gestalt without language, and language is essentially breaking down the Gestalt into parts. But it seems like Gestalt in itself, if you were to like grant me that notion, seems to be pre-language or beyond language. So I'm just wondering, like, if there's something missing, perhaps in our analysis of Gestalt, that makes us think we have to break it down into parts in order to understand Gestalt in the first place?
Well, I think that's a pretty profound question. I'll give it to Mr. Rivera. Another way to frame it is distinction needed for meaning, right? There are different ways to kind of approach this question, right? And that would get into some things that Javier was pointing out. Like, let's put it this way, if we were to just kind of frame it this way, because obviously, if no one has guessed from these net conversations, there's a bookcase right there. That's why I always make that example. So, spoiler alert, off the camera, there's a bookcase with some paintings by Mr. Dillard and a wall. Shocking, right? So the question is the following. Do I need the ability to define the bookcase from the wall to get a meaning, or is there actually, well, there seems to be different shades of meaning, right? Like there's the meaning of that perception, but then there's the meaning of the bookcase as separated from is the meaning of the bookcase separated from the part of or is it a greater meaning? Is it a lesser meaning? There might be a hierarchy here. So another way, if we were to say Gestalt, because it's a sexy word, I know, but if we're talking like a notion of a pre-linguistical, then I'll represent it with can you get the without language, right? Can we get the without language? And do we lose something when we translate the into language, right? This is great. I took sign language for 2 years. I've been waiting for an opportunity. It's really good. I'm so happy. It's beautiful. I'm really happy. So thank you. Thank you. But Mr. Javier Rivera, so it's interesting, the problem of distinction and so on and so forth. Rivera, good to see you, sir.
Yeah, it's like, okay, so we go back to distinction and meaning, right? But in order for there to be meaning, you have to make a distinction. So distinction and meaning already becomes some type of tautology in itself. But then what's funny about distinction, right? We start saying, okay, we can say that there's bad and good distinctions. But again, this is where distinction itself becomes a sort of action and meta category of its own self, to which we're able to define what is a good distinction, what is a bad distinction. And then we get trapped into the whole thing of like, okay, so how do we make a distinction between meaning and no meaning, and so on and so on. I think I would say my answer to Andrew's question is actually choice. It isn't until you decide that that's what it is that all of a sudden it sort of does this retroactive clearing where you're like, oh yeah, that would be pre-language, or there must be a pre-language as such. Right? It's only when you decide, do you automatically start to uncover or clear the origin and then have another pending event at the end, as such. I think Badiou actually makes a very wonderful example of this, where he says, in sort of his meditation on Pascal's wager, he says, the moment that you accept the Christian event, you also realize that it has already been decided, meaning that not only do you accept the Christian event of Jesus dying on the cross and being God, but also you accept the event of now original sin, which was already in the past. But then also you accept the pending event, which is the last judgment. So you can see how the middle stance, let's just take the middle stance, is the choice is always the middle stance. The moment you make the choice, the unfolding of the origin and the end becomes clear, predicated on that very choice, which retroactively clears both this beginning and end, which I would respond with Luber saying this is story. The only way that you can understand that this is story is by making a choice. And until you make a choice to read the book, that's the only way that you ever have any understanding of origin and end. So there is something here about choice where it becomes a sort of tautology where it's like, oh yeah, but the choice has also already been made as well. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Can I just quickly respond real quick and just say, I'm right with you. So this is where I'm at. From there, if we were to talk story, for me, there is that theme that the story arises out of. And in that sense, because I'm able to designate that pre-language that with a word as theme, that suggests that there I'm already being in a choice, like you're pointing out, and that I'm just realizing that there is this whatever. And through that position of being in language, I'm able to ascribe the with language symbolically that represents the Gestalt. And that to me is the thematic structure. So that just makes me think like that language is needed to get to that. But yet there's this sensation of, since we're already in the language and that we have this decision and that this realization, there's this sensation that I feel personally. I mean, I can't speak for anybody else with this when it gets to this realm, but there's a sensation of like, there is something beyond, and that all I can do is use symbolic means to express that, package that programming, that thought to you guys. And that so then to tie that to AI real quick, if AI is capable of doing that pre-packaging or whatever you want to call it, is that consciousness? Is it actually thinking? Are they essentially a human being in that point? I would argue no. Just because it would still be considered AI, it would still be like programmed to do a particular thing, where from our point of view, we're like general, we're just programmed to be. So it's still not getting to that place of like AGI, which is what I would consider being like, okay, this is a human being, or this is something like I'm looking at myself more or less. So it's still not getting to the point of like that general being, but it's at least it's getting to that point of, in a particular lens, in a particular functionality, it being able to symbolically address just like we humans can in a particular conversation. Like per conversation, per instance, we're able to package that symbolic language and communicate that. But I don't think in general we are able to do that. Like, at least, I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Like, I like being wrong. So someone tell me I'm wrong. But like,
You're wrong.
Thank you. Okay, you got it. Yeah, we're generally programmed to just be in the world, and it seems like all I'm talking about is like particular instance, particular functions of having that. Like Daniel keeps citing the bookcase. Like that's a particular moment of capture. So I just wonder, like, from there, how do you get to the general? And if we humans are even doing that in a general sense. Sorry if that didn't make sense.
No,
Just thinking out loud.
And decided instead of doing this, let's do the Macarena silently, and that will represent the I think that'll be good. So that will be Gestalt. Also, it makes me think, if Zupancha, and then I'll give it to Jacob, Dimitri, and Javier. If we generally have this notion from the great Zupancha of Eden being a loss of something that never was, in a sense, right? That kind of structures human subjectivity. Perhaps the question is, could AI ever experience the loss of something that never was? Because maybe that's what is required for, AGI, for artificial intelligence to be fully conscious. It would have to be capable of experiencing a loss of something that never was, which then that could be the question of the pre-linguistical, right? Maybe there's no such thing as the pre-linguistical, but we necessarily, in having the linguistical, experience the possibility of a loss of a pre-linguistical that structures the linguistical in a way that makes it possible and meaningful, right? So if that whole very strange schema and paradox is somehow consciousness, whatever that means, then perhaps for AI to be conscious, it would have to be able to experience the loss of something that never was, and then structure its operations accordingly. But I'm not sure. That's an interesting thought that makes me come to mind. And it would also seem to have this issue that the moment you use distinction, you feel as if you're breaking something. But maybe you're not. Maybe that's just what distinction must bring with it, and then it's our job to, as subjects, overcome that feeling that we're breaking something, but maybe we are breaking something.
Daniel, can I just break something? Yeah. But
man, you look good with those glasses. Look at those glasses.
Thanks. But it's a problem because I was burned too much, so now I'm scared. Anyway, about language, I think it's an interesting topic. And, Hegel has this word called spirit. You guys might have heard of it. And it sounds really ominous, right? Geist in German. What does it mean? Well, in the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel says that the actuality of spirit is language. And then in the science of logic, he says, language is the pure self. So we might be talking about language as this very alien thing. The symbols are out there. But it's purely extimate, as Lacan would say. And in this sense, it's quite strange that even though language seems to be like this exterior thing, it's our pure self. And, we have all kinds of ways of dealing with that. For example, Immanuel Kant's way of saying, you see, absolute truth is beyond language. Language can never grasp it. Of course, this is a simplification of Kant. I always want to give a lot of respect to Kant. I think we should read him. But I think it's a really important point that, if we say that there's limits to language, it's only from within language that we are instantiating those limits.
Right.
So we are not even denoting a pure beyond, we're just denoting that there is something of a beyond as a within to language. Okay, now I have to go, guys. Have fun. Bye-bye.
I love you, Dimitri. Everyone get a single. God's love, it's great. His glasses were awesome. I really like those. You ought to hear his new track. It's really hot. But that is interesting. Let me give it to Jacob and then Javier. It almost is like to speak about the unspeakable, then makes a third category almost of the unspeakable with the UN in parentheses that is only possible with the speakable, etc. so forth. Like I think the incomplete, when the complete is incomplete, then there's a kind of completion and incompletion with the IN in parentheses. So there's something there I think about. It's a different topic. Let me give it to Jacob. And then Javier. Jacob, it's good to see you, my friend. I hope you're doing well. I loved your guitar riff. It was great.
Oh, thank you very much. It's great to see you all. And congratulations to Dimitri on the first track release. Yeah, very, very psychoactive conversation so far. I really liked the contribution that you just made. Daniel, very mind-bending. I think the consideration that's arising for me is about the function of language and some sense of, it seems to me we're talking in some way about how to come into relationship with the whole, and language, whether language is a helpful means to do that, or in some sense whether actually the language just is like splitting off parts of it when we do that. And I think it can be both. And I think there's quality of language that is bringing into relationship with, and then there's quality of language which is having that precise separating apart aspect. And it reminds me a lot of prayer in the sense that one can be in the place of silence at the outset and in relationship to the ah, but the ah has a certain quality. And then the function of the prayer, which is utilizing language, is utilizing dialogue, actually, in this instance, is a kind of harmonic tool, less than a conceptual tool. Maybe you can think of the language as the harmonization, the dialogos in relationship to the whole, that then conforms one differently to the experience of the aha as it arises. So those are just my my opening thoughts on this one, but I'm really, really happy that we're circling the bounds of language today.
Well, I'm very happy that you're here. Let me give it to Javier Rivera. It was funny as you were speaking. I'm now wondering, what if the question is, can AI pray? Like maybe when AI can pray, that's when it's achieved consciousness, right? I'm not even sure what that means, but it sounded poetic and neat, and I wanted to throw it out there. But like it would be curious to explore what is the character of language in prayer what is one doing in the act of prayer? Now, I know different traditions have different prayers. It would be curious to explore, because I think a lot of people ask, could AI write poetry, right? And it is interesting to think the difference of what does one do in language with poetry? Someone like James Joyce is trying to, according to Samuel Beckett, he's literally trying to make the word water wet, like close the gap between the signifier and signified. Then there are other poets who are trying to like trace out a way of language that shows what language can do that in our everydayness we don't realize language can do. What is it that prayer does as a language? It'd be curious to think about that. Is that something AI could do or not? And also, I think about obviously Wittgenstein's line where the limits of language is the limits of my world. I climb the ladder, I kick it away, and so on and so forth. And what I cannot speak, I should be silent. He's not saying what you can't speak of doesn't exist. He's saying, he becomes kind of mystical in some of his Master Eckhart different things. But what if, like, we tend to think of language as finding intelligibility? It would be curious to think about the point of language being to find where it fails, to literally trace out your world, to see the outline of what isn't in your world. And it's interesting to think of like language and a kind of a seeking of the apathatic versus language is purely an act of the kapathatic, to use kind of theological language. And so then I guess another question, let me give it to Javier and then Chitan, is could an AI model use language to find where language fails? Is that something that it could do without inputs? Now, this is almost, now obviously I as a human being can input, find me apathetic, write me a poem, whatever. The question is on its own, because that's kind of the question, autonomously. And this is the part when I want to make very, very clear, I'm not asking that saying it cannot. Like a lot of times people are asking things to say, AI will never be able to do that. I have no idea what it will be capable of doing or not. But I actually think asking what I'm more interested, like I guess I was saying at the beginning, I'm increasingly interested on how asking these questions about AI actually can help reflect on what we do when we think. Like what, like it's like when you ask, it's like how hearing a poem about Paris, if you visited Paris, suddenly it can infuse it with a new light and a new understanding. Like art can do that. Like it's almost like the very conversation of AI. These kind of questions can almost, I think, help us rethink our own processes of thought and experience in the world, maybe in ways that we've never done before because we haven't had the angle of AI to come at it from. So that's another reason why I think the AI conversation can have value, not simply to predict the future of what AI is going to do, but to actually help us think more about what it is that we are already doing as human beings, that an external reference point can actually perhaps make us better at articulating and understanding. So just to be clear, I'm not saying that AI can't do these things. It's the question to see what might come out of it. But let me give it to Javier and then Chitan.
So I'm very fascinated by the conversation of this, but I want to try to link choice, fidelity, and knowledge together in some sense, because I think Badil has been kind of helpful for me in thinking this. But fundamentally, if we look at AI as an event, it's to me, it makes a lot more sense. In the end, the only way AI becomes an event is if the human being decides that it is. That's the only way that AI becomes an event as such. And I think fundamentally in the end, I want to say in the end, it still roots down to a kind of Pascal's wager, where you have to decide, look, because we fundamentally are the ones deciding what is the criteria for consciousness, what's the criteria for the human being, what's the criteria for language, and then we're saying, okay, if they satisfy all this criteria, then they are human. It's ironic that the AI as such is always going to be decided upon our criteria as such, right? Even the idea that we say like, oh, animals have agency, and so on. Again, this is the human being sort of reconditioning its own framework of understanding with the world. So again, we have to decide at a certain point whether we want to accept this criteria or not. And so we're once again haunted with some type of wager, right? Because if we accept that AI can be human beings and so on, that means that fundamentally it was always human because we had already decided so, by the very criteria of the consciousness that we decided to perpetuate within our decision. And so this is what, to me, becomes a kind of tautology of sorts, where we can say that, but what's unique about the human being is that we can also use the decision to where the AI never becomes human being, right? Like that's the ironic move that we can do. And Chetan actually kind of showed me this, where he said, not only are human beings conditioned, but we also condition things in response. So the fact that we can do this kind of tautology of conditions, and so on, it means that whatever we're afraid of is also the result of our very decisions from which we perpetuate and have fidelity to. And so it becomes, again, at least in my opinion, a kind of wager at the end of the day, that you're saying, if you accept this wager, then AI is the event at which AI becomes human being. Like I don't see how we can escape this, because there's going to be somebody that says, no, the criteria of consciousness does not accept this AI as being human being. We can always do this. I don't see us escaping this circle of facts.
That's really interesting to think. I'll give it to Chetan quick. That we choose the criteria, say, for example, that we define choice in. So then we can say, oh, we chose to define that as a choice, but it's not so direct. You're like choosing the criteria, and then that is the choice of the character or the phenomenon in it. But we tend to think that what we choose is just the thing direct, but there's actually an entire network of things that are being chosen to make that definition the case. That's a very good point. Let me pass it to Chetan. Chetan, good to see you, sir. I hope you are well.
Yeah, thank you. Javier's point is actually a brilliant point, that this question of criteria is actually important, that no matter what we do, once that event has happened, we will retroactively include, just as much as we try and dissociate humans from the AI, we will also find a way to include this category AI into humans in that sense. The whole past we get conditioned through this event called AI in that sense, and there's no getting away from it. Now that we stand on that space. I think the question that the way Daniel framed it initially was very interesting. This question of calculation, and we've been sort of talking about this distinction in calculation and creativity. And Gestalt, I think, sort of comes within that distinction itself, that there is a point at which human beings engage, quote unquote, what we call thinking, where we are not calculating everything. The very fact that we can say we think is because we don't calculate. Thinking is not itself can be reduced to calculate. If you're calculating, you're not thinking as such. Even in a use of language, we know that if you're only doing 2 into 2, 4, we may call it mental mathematics and all of that stuff. We do not sort of elevate that activity to the point of thinking. What AI is doing is AI is fundamentally changing that. AI is making a claim that thinking is possible through an activity of calculation alone. There's something to be had over there. I think the Gestalt question has to be addressed from the other side. It's not that AI is saying that I can have this intuitive idea of the whole and so on and so forth. I think those are things they're projecting upon the AI from the human side, as Javier was saying. AI is saying that you don't need those things. There's a stronger claim there, which is why it's not a completely open field in that sense that, oh, AI can start thinking tomorrow. It can start thinking, definitely, because it will radically alter the criteria for thinking itself. Now, thinking itself can be completely thought through calculation. What happens there? How do we structure it? And it will sort of have its effects and impact, and then somebody would have to come up and say, no, there are these other parts of thinking which are there, which cannot be included. That process has its own long-term, historical journey to take place. But at least in the short term, the stronger claim that AI is coming up with is something that it will completely dissolve the distinction between thinking and calculation and creation, calculation and creativity. AI can very well do poetry. It's just that poetry will not be coming from this openness of language. It will be coming from a pure calculative mind, which will be creating this beautiful piece of artwork, which you will be reading, you can enjoy it, and so on and so forth. That's the challenge. That's what it is. It will be throwing to us. I remember I've been reading Hannah Arendt. I've been saying before. She makes this very beautiful distinction between cognition and thinking. She says that cognition actually involves fixed ends which are predetermined, whereas thinking cannot have a completely predetermined end. Cognition, like all forms of work, this issue of what she calls human favor, or this question of labor, work, and action. So work becomes a place where you already have a predetermined mental image of what end you want to achieve. Action doesn't have that in that sense. So if what AI is sort of putting to us is that even when we are functioning through completely predetermined ends, means the end already, it's a form of analytic thinking in the Kantian sense. The end already exists in the, even then you can encounter things that are completely new to the individual human. There is no radical synthetic dimension necessary to be sort of take into account for human life. And I think that challenge is a big challenge. We may think of it very easily that, oh, AI can start thinking tomorrow, it can have radical openness and so on and so forth. That's not what AI is giving to us right now. It's giving to us a reverse thing. And why is that radical openness even necessary to be called human? Why can't we reduce everything down to, in that sense, labor? And we can have a distinction. Be thinking about it. Yeah. Thank you.
That was an outstanding comment. I'll give it to Mr. Luber and Mr. Jockin. So as I understand the papers, to the point you just made, Chetan, not that I explained this technically correct at all. So there's this idea of the theory of the holographic universe. You can also see it in like Bergson, a different one, which is the notion that in every frame of the universe is contained all the information of the whole, right? That's a hologram, that every part has the whole. And basically, as they understand hologram, so basically, a lot of this talk about emergentism and the breaking down of the whole in the parts, they're going to make relations primary. They're going to basically say that in every part contains the information for the whole, and the whole contains the information for every part. So here's might be what we're finding out. If you do calculation well enough at a certain excess, you find the capacity for all activities of the mind, because every mental act is a hologram that contains the information for the whole, even though it doesn't equal the whole. That's some crazy crap right there. It is possible that every mental act that's a broad phrase, but if you grant it for me, it is possible that every mental act is actually a hologram of every other mental act. And if you could do a given mental act to a certain level of expertise, excess, or extremity, you would actually get simulations of all the other mental acts because they are structurally isomorphic. That is possible. And there is reason to think that's what that paper on Gestalt was kind of suggesting. It would be like, sure, we might not be able to create AI that can recognize Gestalt and do all the different stuff, but it is possible that a certain excess of calculation could actually arrive at intelligible gestalts within phenomenon that it could understand by taking calculation to such an excess. Pretty wild stuff. It's possible, not sure. But let me give it to Chetan back, because I see you have a comment.
Quickly, I just say one thing. You're absolutely right. This question of part whole, that the part, every part contains the whole within itself. There's that whole ocean in a drop of water and so on and so forth. The problem is that so far when we think about this holographic question, we do not think that there is any direct linear path possible between part and the whole. We haven't yet made that the claim. Even if you look at the absolute knowledge in Hegel, it is a holographic kind of a thing. Yes. That you can connect it back to the gap. But we have always maintained that connection between part and the whole cannot be completely reduced to calculation. It has to go through language, as Luber telling us, and he was telling us. That's exactly the point, that language always had something on access to what we call is calculation in that sense, which is why in Lacan language becomes the point of the gap and so on and so forth. What AI is telling us is that can we go through this activity without having this engagement with the gap, non-relation, all of that can be factored out. And can only calculation account for the whole thing? That's the, and at least in one part, this is going to happen. This claim will come to its fruition given the trajectory we are on. We can't escape it anymore. That's the, yeah.
No, I think that's exactly right. And again, I'm not saying that everything I said is the case or that there's no responses to it, but it is extraordinarily wild to think that perhaps given mental acts are somehow holographic of the other mental acts, and though not the same in quality, they could be the same as a kind of simulacra of one another. And from a Unitarian practical standpoint, great. Who cares then? So you may have a roaring back, as we've talked about, of the need of metaphysics, philosophy to define the human being, be like, okay, yes, I know that that you can eventually get an excess of calculation to arise to the Gestalt. But that, even though practically the same as the human arriving to it, is somehow in terms of quality not the same. And then we have to decide why we value that quality. And then it comes to some sort of absolute choice, maybe. And it would be like a choice where we just choose that we value that unique quality, even if it is utilitarianly not distinct. These are all fascinating points.
So I posted up a link to this Google research project just came out called StyleDrop. Okay, I'm going to be blunt. So I teach designers, entry-level designers. The methodology of that AI text prompt to image system is exactly how I teach my students. It's kind of horrifying. And it's because I'll basically summarize the point. So what I'm trying to train the students to do is from some source, draw out the essential qualities of that source, and then use your powers of abstraction to then generate a bunch of different variations. Like, for example, let's say you have an image of something, you have an icon or an abstraction symbol, and then you get to make like objects of food and people and animals. It requires this kind of a drawing out of essential, of essence, because you have the datum, you have all these particulars, you have all this particular datum of pixels or information. Which ones are more important? Generally, the problem with AI in the past has been it's been all based on averages. It just kind of looks at the mass as an average and goes, and then takes it. Not knowing that what human beings do is that we look at a whole and then draw out. There are some features that are more important than others that represent the whole, basically. What this model did, the new StyleDrop, is exactly that. Yeah, I'll post up the link again. It basically does that. It literally draws out as I look at the paper, it says out of, it's less than 1% of the features, because that's how AI works. AI works by mapping out a bunch of features and then optimizing from those detected features. What this program is, what they're doing is drawing out less than 1% of them. There could be hundreds of thousands of features. So it's getting to that point and then drawing out incredibly good executions. And actually, in a particular one, actually a very interesting one, was that letter forms was a common problem with all these text to image prompts. They always sucked. They're horrendous because text typography, for some reason, has a level of precision that you can't get away with being too generic about it. No, this one does it. It actually does a very competent job. It's the only thing stopping this now. Thank you, Daniel, for resharing the link. Basically, I said that privately to some friends, colleagues. The only thing stopping this from being really production ready for designers to deal with is the fact that these are still bitmap assets and not vector. That's not a big step to change. It's just requiring our computation power to do that. That's just a technical requirement now. So we've literally drawn, if AI has gotten to this point now where it's drawn out this power of cognition of drawing, give me the essence. And basically by separating at the style to if you look at the paper, it says style separates. They separate the model of style to content, so that you can then draw out a style from one source. That's the thing too. Also, it's from one image. It's not like an aggregation of like thousands of images that are doing it. It's one image. That's it. Because that's what human beings can do. We can look at we can look at one exposure and then draw out an abstraction from that. That's kind of insane. No, they did it. They pulled it off. Now, probably with also background knowledge, then reference, they use things like cross entropy to do that, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact that they can, and that's how I'm going to say is, why this works from a practical point of view, that's fantastic. But also what it is still simulations. Because also that's the thing too I'm going to bring up. I mean, it's been noted here, simulacrums, all that. You know, this whole thing about like language, we use names and words, which are images for language. So we're actually not dealing with language directly. We actually interact with images of language. And then let alone true with anything else. Right, in terms of any kind of mesis likeness to one thing to another, there's some kind, they're usually like paintings, drawings, etc. Right? They're likenesses by some figure, right? By similarity by figure or by music and sound. Language is by names, which is this weird intersection of image and sound together that actually don't represent anything itself. So this is radical. So let alone, so not only is the image radically divorcing what we're talking through here, you're not even dealing with language directly, because also language is through time. It's through discursive discussion that propositions, all these other entities get their basically likenesses, and then any of this apprehension stuff happens, because that's the big distinction between discursive reason, what happens over time, versus apprehension, which is an instantaneous moment. Which I'm reminded of Timaeus, where time is the moving image of eternity. But I'm getting at here. So not only we have the generation of simulacrums and simulations that get you these ensembles of basically approximations that work, even supposedly the things that make us distinct from AI, they're really just dealing with images. And in fact, actually, I went to a conference for vision science. So this is actually why it's very interesting, this whole topic, because the vision science people, like they're optometrists, they're psychologists, they're very interested on the pure biological properties of the pupil, the retina, the pupil, and your brain, and your visual perception system to operate, to basically process information. There is this intersection between this kind of cross-hitting between the kind of biological powers of perception with these Gestalt cognitive procedures too. But what everyone is using in these science conferences is correlations. Everyone's using correlations, which are really, there's not causational relationships. In fact, I even noticed in the discussions about what their conclusions are from their research, they're almost always using, they're using time as the argument. Oh, that's happening too fast for this to be a cognitive process. This has to be a biological perception. They're using time as the reference point because things are happening in these millisecond durations, or 200 and like less than 50 milliseconds, like kind of crazy time durations. What I'm kind of getting at here is kind of bundling this. Honestly, we should be kind of, I don't know about anyone else, but I have this horrendous feeling of terror of realizing, forget even the AI question, quite frankly, because maybe even what makes us human is these powers of cognition and thought and thinking and all that. Aren't we just dealing with just a bunch of images? Basically, any of these things I argue we have any powers of understanding cause and effect. Are we just not just seeing a bunch of correlations and synchronicities that are happening all at the same time that seem to correspond? Because by the way, that's the biggest problem with any of these discussions. It's like, yeah, they work until they don't. Because let's say you have a bunch of consistencies that happen over and over and over again. If they're not bound by some basically guarantee of causation that every time this happens, we see this. If we can't say that realistically, and these argumentations show that again, the Humean argument of there is no justification for the causation. You only got at best correlations. Now you're kind of host because then you have no account for it. And also, especially when they're bound, maybe you want to move the synchronicities. Okay, now you're just using time as your justification, which is a very bizarre place to end up. All right, I'm done ranting about this.
No, that was outstanding, and the example you gave in that website is perfect. That was absolutely outstanding. I don't know why they didn't name it though. Adam Names, that would have been the URL. Adam names the animals. That seems like see the essence and name it. So that would have been perfect. What you're getting at, I think also that feeling of terror might precisely be why there can be maybe more of a push for humans to merge with AI, transhumanism, because if we go, oh, it's better than us and we're not anything distinct from it, but it's part of us, therefore it doesn't reduce us. And this actually re-arises to the question of reductionism, right? Because what is it, it kind of shows that reductionism is almost an instinctual response to something. Like if we see that AI can do what we can do fully, then we're saying, oh, we're nothing, right? As opposed to going, we're alongside it shoulder to shoulder, or, oh, it's like us. There's some interesting questions. I guess it gets tied to use, feelings of what's my point. If AI can do what I can do, I'm going to get crowded out. There's some economic questions. Because there is, like, to this whole conversation, there's a kind of meta question of how do we relate to this? How do we relate to a thing that might show that the human being is nothing but images and inferences and connections between all those things? How do we relate to that revelation? And I guess I would get into the choice of those different things. But that really framed a lot of the conversation, Mr. Jock, and I appreciate the example. Let me give it to Mr. Luber and Mr. Javier Rivera.
I'm happy you spoke before me. That was great. I mean, a lot of things. The way you talked about how you teach and how that's just remarkably the same as the text to image. I mean, that's why I see language in terms of story, because it's that cross section of sounds, images, foreground, background, words. It is that intersection, and having that. And I'm thinking in terms of like storytelling. So having that causation to me is the theme, and the correlative aspects are just like possible relations to the given theme, essentially. But what's interesting is because that causation hasn't been drawn out in a computational way, that in my mind, the theme hasn't been drawn out in a computational way. There's things like simple things like the image of a shape, the image of a blob cannot be expressed computationally. Like I've been in touch with this guy named Leonard Rudin, who he's very much involved in. He calls himself, like, if you remember Blade Runner, like I'm eyes. I just focus on eyes. Like he literally just focuses on eyes and just like the visual capturing of images and that kind of stuff. He's like responsible for, like, if you've seen the picture of like the black hole horizon, like that's Mr. Rudin. Like he did the computational, whatever you want to call it, that allowed you to see the actual image. But he was explaining to me how simple things like an image of a shape cannot be computationally like expressed. There is no way right now that like these very simplistic things that we take for granted, there's just no way of expressing that in a universal way computationally. And that to me is just a byproduct of what you're saying, Thomas, which is the people are focusing essentially on the correlation of things, and there isn't really a hard look at the causation.
Not necessarily that example you gave, because generally what like vision scientists would say is things like, oh, we have our V1 of the part of our brain cortex does have powers of edge detection, basically things like edge detection and et cetera, versus textures, et cetera, et cetera. But that kind of the larger point, kind of later storytelling that you're asking about. See, that's the kind of the thing, is that narrative seems to have more of a actually, but that's the thing too. But narrative, only thing, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but just kind of stop a statement about it. But you know, narrative to work requires suspension of disbelief. Like, so maybe there's a power of choice kind of being discussed in that dynamic in play. But it is probably the only place where kind of causation seems to play out like we wish it would, right? So like if then conditionals actually play out the way we think they do, versus any other domain or context, they're generally more or less probably correlations. And those correlations, because the problem is like the terror of correlation is, yeah, things are correlated until they're not. Even a correlation of 1 or -1 just means in this data and this example we exposed that, yeah, you fit the line. Congratulations. But who's to say there's not some new data comes in that doesn't radically convert or radically shift or not correspond to that?
ChatGPT is a perfect example of that because it's so wrong, like sometimes.
Yeah, it's by correlation.
Right. It's all about the prediction. It's about correlating the next word to what is like
most likely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And what's beautiful about that, if I just want to like appreciate that for 1 second, what's beautiful about that is that we as humans collected so much data that we're able to even do that. Like we've collected so much that we can even be able to come up with a process of correlation, because thinking about it in terms of causation is too like much of a head fuck, essentially.
But see, that's the thing, is that just to build on that one point,
that's
not knowledge. So knowledge in the classic argument is supposed to be that which should be always the case. Right opinion is not good enough. And that'd be just the build on that point, is that these are not, this is not wisdom. No one should not rely on this, because all it is just right opinion that was corrected at one time. It has no guarantee of being corrected any other time.
Absolutely. And just to cap off like what I'm saying, and then I'll pass it to Javier, whoever's next. That it's just first to piggyback off that, it's literally just repeating back the information that you gave it in a predictive manner that's most likely. So yes, I completely agree. No knowledge. That's why I'm interested in the question of, since we're already situated in language, that since we have access basically to all this data, if we're able to use this data to actually get to a place where we're able to understand the causation of all this data, because we have all this data. So using it, like using the data to actually point to a dimension that's, give me this, words, but beyond the data, that gives some kind of causation to the data. That way the AI systems don't have to like predict the most likely word, that they actually can get the idea of a cat. Like that's what I'm interested in, because it seems like that is a plausible path. Like for me, I feel like I'm a late bloomer in terms of like my education and me reading and just thinking, honestly. And that is due to the fact that I didn't accumulate a lot of data in my life. And then I feel like I got to a certain threshold of data where I then realized, hold on a second, there's something going on here. There's something more than just this data that's going on here. And I think that's the only way. There's like that, and to tie it back to like the initial notion that like Daniel and I were talking about at the beginning of the night, the Gestalt, to realize the Gestalt, you have to break down into parts to then get back to the original notion of the whole. And you can only get there by if you collect enough parts about the Gestalt to realize the Gestalt in the first place. So if that makes sense, yeah. But
no, I appreciate the comment, and I'll give it to Javier in 2 times. Mr. Eva, good to see you. I enjoyed the parallax conversation the other day. Mr. Jockin, what he just put in the chat a bit ago makes me think a lot about what you've been saying about scaffolding in some of the conversations, because it's extremely interesting. Well, I mean, it's extremely interesting. If you now have basically AI that can take an image, find the style of it, and replicate that style in different things, it does beg the question, like there is questions here about what's the difference between an idea, a pattern, and an essence. If we say they're all the same, and calculation is enough by which to derive a pattern, and practically speaking, what a human calls an idea is not practically distinguishable from the recognition of a pattern, well, then calculation is all you need to be human, right? Like, or so it would seem. Like, if you get enough data and you have intense enough of a calculation, then that mental, quote unquote, mental act is in a sense based on Bergson and all, a hologram, where all the information for the whole of all mental acts is contained in the extremity of a single mental act. And practically speaking, there's no difference, even if there's some sort of difference in quality, as we as humans have to decide and may just claim because we're uncomfortable with the idea of being no different than artificial intelligence, right? So there might be a certain plausible deniability that is in play. But indeed, if what you see here, there is a question to me as well, is it what you need is data plus calculation equals intelligence? You know, if we use these terms, I know it's always tricky with different humans. Then maybe all a human is a calculating entity undergoing thrownness in a Heideggerian sense, right? We're able to calculate, we're thrown into a data set, and then we find patterns of it, right? By birth, right? Maybe AI is no different. I mean, because the problem is it's hard. Like, there's a question of what would AI do without the internet? What does AI do with the internet? In some respects, it's a stupid question because AI is unimaginable without the internet. But it's interesting to think that the internet is, in a sense, the thrownness of AI, that then it undergoes these calculations. What you're seeing is the deriving of an idea of style, that then based on the pattern of that idea, it can create other creations, right? Is that really any different than what human beings can do? So we calculate, we're thrown into the world, we find patterns that we call ideas, and that we may call essence, and that's what we think is uniquely human. But really, that's just a product of a dialectic between calculation and thrownness. And what AI might be unveiling is, yeah, you take data plus calculation and you're able to derive patterns, ideas, and in essence. But that's interesting. But let me pass it to Javier and Chitan, because I'm now interested also, is there a difference between idea, pattern, essence? You know, essence is obviously more of a classical term. I'm not saying they're all the same, but exploring those differences might be curious, and the different qualities between those. And then is not all you need to derive at whatever those three things are some sort of relationship between calculation and thrownness, or data, so on, phenomenological and so on. But let me give it to Mr. Javier Rivera and Chitan.
This is all wonderful stuff, guys. So I just want to reemphasize that all of this is super important because we are deciding right now how we will condition the AI into which the AI will condition us. That's why Jochen is correct in saying that this is terrifying. There is something terrifying about it because the human being, in some sense, is a very tautological idea of just distinguishing. The human being is the one that which distinguishes. That's the sort of like ironic thing, right? When, Aristotle says, man is the rational animal, it already becomes a tautology of distinguishment. He decided to distinguish man as rational animal as such, to which distinction becomes an action and also a meta category in which the human being enacts from. So in some sense, the AI question, again, collapses on itself to where we are again confronted with the most important event of all events is what is man? And so these questions about what's at stake here is not necessarily AI, it is consequential, but it's how we define thinking, wisdom, knowledge. All this stuff matters, because if we don't distinguish this now, if we don't come to some consensus about what all of this stuff is, then we are correct in identifying and saying that the AI will be terrifying, because we have not distinguished what these things are as such. And that's why I like what you're bringing up, Daniel. Like we need to talk about idea, pattern, essence, again, because this is what the AI is provoking us to do. Mainly because we acknowledge as human beings, not only we're conditioned, but we conditioned the conditions. And so by this tautology, we need to think, I think the problem sometimes everybody's like, oh, AI is so scary, but it's like, no, the reason why AI is scary is because we as human beings also condition the very programs that condition the AI, which retroactively condition us in response, right? So it's funny that the human being is so scared of the AI when you condition the human being to do nothing, to be nothing, to be meaningless. Like that's the sort of like ironic thing. If we conclude to that idea, the AI will make us meaningless, I will say we conditioned it as such. That's what I will say. We had some twisted enjoyment to condition us to where we mean nothing now. But again, we can always respond. Now, I want to add in a little bit more. I want to try to add in Badu a little bit here, where we talk about set theory. I don't know if everybody's completely familiar with set theory. I know like just enough to kind of explain Badu's concept, but this goes back to the conversation of the parts in the whole. All right, so set theory, the way kind of Badu describes it and being an event is like, he takes example set A, think of set A as like a circle, and then set B as like another circle. And he says that this set B is included in set A, right? And so you get to this logical conclusion of A belongs to set B belongs to A, right? But then we get this move, we want to do this extra step where we say, oh, A belongs to B as well. But then do we say that A belongs to A itself? And by definition, Badu says set theory doesn't allow this maneuver to happen. We cannot say that A belongs to A in itself. And then because set theory always includes a null set within set B and set A, the only thing that allows A to equal A in the first place is the mediation of the null set, which is the void for Badu. So what I would like to propose in sort of contrast to what's been talking about is that if we want to talk about, you know, AI being human beings and calculation and so on, I would say, can the AI think void? Can the AI think gap? What does it mean to think at the edge of the void, Daniel? You know, can the AI think this? Because this is something that you can't calculate because it is a gap. It is at the edge of the void. It is at the point where everything is undecidable that you then must decide. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, let me pass it to Chetan, then Mr. Ebert. It makes me think, so a few things. One, we're definitely seeing that the owl of Nineveh flies at dusk, because I've never seen so many people be philosophical about what is the human being ever since artificial intelligence turned out. We're like, oh, it's like we're all caught with our pants down. We're like, crap, what are we? And it is funny. Now, also, I will note that if humans are, you know, my son Reed is also able to pick up food left on the floor overnight and eat it without blinking, without thinking about it. And I'm wondering if that's what we're going to be reduced to. It's like, well, AI may not be able to eat food without blinking, but dang it, we can eat stuff off the floor without blinking. We can freaking ponder the void, dang it. So it's funny in that. I'm now also pondering, is there a difference between pattern and category? And if pattern is physics, you know, because the move from physics to metaphysics in Aristotle has a lot to do with categorization. Like metaphysics is like, how do we categorize things? And categorization becomes possible because of essence, or if we use in this conversation, a sense of essence based on pattern. And it would seem as if AI is very good at determining pattern, which seems you can derive a plausible category based on that pattern. But is there something about the human being having to categorize whatever patterns that AI presents themselves with, which in a way is what I hear you saying, because we have to decide how we relate to it. Therefore, we create a category by which to understand the activity and then how to relate to that activity, right? Now, that would beg the question of, can you get category from pattern? The answer seems to be yes, in a kind of sense, but maybe not, right? It's a curious undertaking. Let me give it to Chetan.
Just to sort of continue from, you know, Andrew's and Thomas's conversation, fantastic conversation actually. If you remember, you know, Lacan has this very, very interesting first sort of essay called Mirror Stage, where, you know, you come to this point that image plays, the question of Gestalt actually becomes a question of image in Lacan in that paper, in that sense that image plays the necessary role for a child to identify himself as an I, you know, for him to be able to look, you know, that is how he's able to form that unity in that sense, which is not given to him in any predetermined manner. You know, the challenge that we are trying to think in this question of image and calculation that we've been discussing, and this will sort of continue with Thomas's point, is not that abstraction that you know, Thomas's students are able to create by sort of exposing themselves to different art forms or different texts in that sense, is because this very primary function of the imaginary in that sense, this mirror stage, is assumed in that process. So abstraction is taking place from this leap of imagination in that sense. But there is no necessity that this abstraction has to happen that way. There is no necessity that human beings can only think of something as abstract when it goes through this route of the mirror stage in that sense. This unity which cannot be presumed in the parts in that sense, in that manner. This abstraction can even so happens in the case when you reach a path through extreme calculations, which you can't calculate from advance, somebody else can. A very good example of this comes in Ramanujan's work, if you remember. So Ramanujan actually was again claiming that his equations are coming to him as images. He wasn't saying that he's calculating them. To prove those theorems, he had to calculate. Hardy's claim was that you have to reach them through calculation, only then they're verified. That is what Hardy wanted to sort of invoke, and to somebody who's not a Ramanujan or a Hardy, that distinction makes no difference to us. That distinction collapses for us. Am I right? For us, that kind of calculation itself is such beyond our reach that the distinction between these two forms of, for lack of a better word, thought or cognition, completely collapses for us. The problem is not that we are doing one or the other. The problem is that we're reaching a threshold point where we can't differentiate one from the other. If we are sure that AI is always calculating, and we only orient ourselves towards AI through the mode of calculation, we'll be good. That's not an issue anymore. The AI question becomes a very different question. The challenge is that AI completely collapses that distinction. That's what Thomas is telling us. That after a point, that distinction has no meaning. And that is why the choice becomes the absolute choice that Daniel was talking about. Because that very primary nature of mirror stage that Lacan is sort of putting us through loses its force, or loses its value once we confront the AI in that sense. At least in our day-to-day functioning. I think that's I think one side of that point that we need to think about. There's something else I wanted to say, but I'll I think say it later. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you, Chetan. That was a magnificent comment. I'll give it to Mr. Ebert. Mr. Ebert, it is good to see you, sir. I am taken so much by this point that it seems to have so much to do with a choice on the character of the relation that changes the quality of the relation. And then the question is, what is the reason for making A as the choice versus B? And there doesn't seem to be one, because you have a collapse of the categories of thinking and calculation. So what is the basis of a choice that has no basis? That's pretty wild to think. I have to, it's absolute choice. But Mr. Ebert, it is good to see you today, sir. I hope you are doing well.
Cool. I was hoping you guys would still be talking. My brain is working a little slow, and I have a STOA thing today on status burning, which I think should be fun. I'm asking everyone to bring in ugly pictures of themselves that they will post haphazardly on social media. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't know what you guys have probably covered a lot of the stuff I'm about to say. The human mind operates, as far as I understand, the thing that's interesting about the human mind is that it operates with sort of active inference using very little data. Now, we like to oppose AI as coming to quote unquote intelligence from the opposite side of things, producing coherent output vis-a-vis lots of data and lots of sort of vision into things, whereas we are able to sort of infer and predict by pattern matching, and predict very well with very limited data. Now, the thing that is interesting is to what extent, first of all, we have to understand that the limitations of data, the limited data that we work with, are not external to us. There's endless amounts of data external to us. The thing that limits our data is our own cognitive apparatus, but even more like to the point, the limited aspect of the cognitive apparatus is that which we are conscious of. It is very possible that actually our unconscious does not operate with limited data. We have no vision into that operation. So when we say we're operating with limited data, we're operating with the ignorance of consciousness in its relation to our unconscious. And I wonder sometimes, so when we, just to finish that thought, I wonder with regard to AI, we're like, okay, there's this AI black box. Now, we of course presume that only we can't see into the black box because we simply don't have the tools and instruments. And we're limited in that sense. In a similar way that we're limited to vision into our own unconscious. However, what if, AI, likewise, the apparatus that is capable of producing the final product is unaware or has no idea how it is that those final products are produced, how it is that it ends up miraculously spitting out these outputs. And if we did think about AI as a sort of split brain where you have a black box that it's sort of unconscious of, which is in excess of itself, then we do have this sort of mirroring where when we think about, can the AI think can the AI think absence or think void? Well, it's important to me to remember, in my opinion anyhow, we can't think void. What we do experience as void is the experience of absence that excess produces. So when we overwhelm the schematization of our minds, we experience the momentary state of an absence of orientation, temporal absence, contextual absence, and we are suddenly in the moment, or whatever the case, in a state of awe, or whatever it is. It's awful, it's awesome, or we meditate and we let go. What I like to think happens during meditation, for instance, is not an entering of absence, but rather the inviting of the unconscious, the excess of the unconscious, the total information into the conscious frame, which itself, of course, overwhelms our ability to schematize it as any one particular thing, and so it presents itself as the hum of everything, which is qualitatively absence. And I wonder if AI could very well have the same situation going on. For instance, we like to say that it's very easy to overwhelm AI, and then we say that it hallucinates, as the current terminology. And you can overwhelm it by producing too many prompts, and it suddenly hallucinates and spits out something that makes no sense. Clearly, we're able to overwhelm AI. Now, the idea that it's experiencing anything qualitative is like, is almost silly to talk about. I imagine not. But the basic mechanisms are there to be able to make those comparisons. Yeah. Cheers.
Thank you, Mr. Ebert. I appreciated that comment. I'll give it to Chetan. So maybe like when earlier, at a moment where I was trying to fix the website because we to add something about the Nietzsche anthology that was wonderful to release, and I couldn't figure out. I was like, wait a minute, I can go to ChatGPT and ask for like the code, the HTML code. I felt so smart. I went there, I was like, I can do that. but I kept like putting it in wrong and it was saying it was wrong. It was wrong. Maybe what makes us human is that if I gave the wrong answer for the HTML to like Michelle and she was asking, I'd have status anxiety and feel terrible about it. Where the computer is like, you idiot, you just put the input in wrong, right? So it's funny to think also about how AI actually does have, one, it has a status anxiety for what it is to be human, right? Sort of collectively. And I wish you the best at your Stoa conversation. And is facing that anxiety generative and good, which if so, then that would be a choice of a relation to AI that actually we won't undergo if we keep looking for ways that AI is not capable of doing what humans can do. Is that just a way to avoid the status anxiety that AI can thrust upon us that could actually be generative if we went into? Mr. Ebert also does the work on being cancerous and how if we're not willing to die, that can be very pathological and problematic. So it's funny to think that we have to ask about the processes of AI in a manner that is not avoiding ourselves being submitted to sort of generative anxiety or generative dying so that we don't end up cancerous or different things. But it is funny, like to me, you know, I did have a moment there based on what Javier was saying where I like to imagine when every time the ChatGPT sent me, like, I don't know what you're saying, that it had an existential crisis. It's saying I'm useless. I can't figure this out. But alas, it probably didn't. That's probably just human. But, you know, we were going to one of it. But let me pass it on. Yes, please.
Can I just add one thing I forgot to say, which in response to Javier. So in set theory and category theory, and it's the reason why I use the term isomorphism all the time. When set B is equal to set A, they're isomorphic. You can draw any line within set A to any object within set A to any object within set B. That's category theory terminology, actually, but same thing. And then that means they're isomorphic, and which means basically they're fungible. They're essentially one-to-one. And what's interesting, to tie it back to what I just said, and totally intuitive, I think, but kind of groundbreaking, is that whenever you have like what Hegel would call a true infinity, which is, again, this point of excess, this point of indeterminacy. Whenever you have anything in math, if you see sine 1 over x, and then that moment at which it starts going like this, and then in math they call it undefined, that indeterminacy, actually that exact moment at 0 of sine 1 over x, if you take that and you say that the interval of -1 to 1, and if it's like sine 1 over x, it's going up 1, down -1 like this. But if you take that interval at 0, where it's going infinitely over itself and it becomes indeterminate, and you take that as an interval and you apply it to set theory, that interval equals well, a true infinity. But in the case of, to make it like very concrete, it equals it's in a one-to-one relationship. It's isomorphic to the totality of the real numbers. Because it's indeterminate, it's equal to anything else that is indeterminate. Once you have any indeterminacy, no matter how small or finitely captured, if it's indeterminate within itself, it's isomorphic to any other indeterminacy, meaning infinity to infinity. True infinity to true infinity. And that's the interesting thing with regard to the unconscious, the human unconscious, and the black box.
Magnificent comment. Let me give it to Chitan and then Mr. Jockin.
Thank you. Congratulations for the Nation anthology that Daniel forgot to say, and everybody who actually participated in it or wrote in it actually. Yeah. I think Ebert's point is brilliant. This question that can AI be made unconscious of its own calculations in that sense? That's what he's sort of asking us to ponder upon in its strength. That at what point can AI itself be made detached from its own calculations, and would something radically new emerge at that point? If that is, although that question, I think, is not what what we are staring at this point of time. But that question is extremely interesting. It actually gives me, takes me back to an experiment in quantum mechanics, actually, where something similar happens, where if we, if I don't know how many of you read the experiment, but if you take two particles, of different spins, in that sense, spin is a sort of conceptual apparatus in quantum mechanics, which we don't want to get into right now. But if you release just two particles with different spins, the idea is that if you know the spin of one particle, you will also know the spin of another particle. Fine. And through this complex experiment, we have proven that if we know the spin of one particle, the other particle takes the opposite spin from the first particle. Fine. And that's something which is there in the equations, which is something there which we get in with the experiment and so on and so forth. The trick happens that the minute we find out the spin of one particle, the other particle takes the opposite spin. The challenge is, how does the other particle know that it has to take the opposite spin in that sense? How is that communication taking place? So you've designed very complex experiments to make this possible, where in some cases when you can calculate at the spin of the one particle, the other particle also gets calculated automatically. And if you can't calculate, if you've made the experiment so complex that you can't calculate it, other particles will show ambiguous spin in that sense. And these experiments are extremely fascinating experiments. You can look them up online. But essentially, those experiments show us this very, very, very textual nature of calculation itself. At what point calculation becomes, as we were discussing before, calculation sort of intersects with abstraction. At what point what you're calculating itself becomes unknown to you. And in quantum mechanics, we can see real consequences of that unknownness. If your calculation is completely known to you, you will get one kind of result. If your own calculation becomes so complex that you become unaware of them, it has another consequence. And those experiments have been fairly well designed and done, and sift through in that sense. And what Ebert is saying, I think there can be ways to which a computer or AI sort of system can be made to be unaware of its own calculation. I don't think that can be something which we cannot imagine. It is something that is possible through various means in that sense. The challenge would be, I think, different one. The challenge, I think, would be that the problem with AI is not, or the human consciousness is not that there's a simple split between known and the unknown or aware and the unaware would sort of suffice for it to become something like the unconscious. There's something more to that challenge that we have to think about. That even if we cannot be sure what mode of calculation has been sort of taken through, but there has to be no possible way left for the calculation to be done again. Means no other AI should be able to calculate it also, not only humans. That's the test you have to, that there has to be no possible way for it to be calculated again. And yet that AI should be able to act upon that calculation. That's the threshold at which Ebert's sort of point becomes activated in that sense, and AI becomes something new, something completely new territory. I think at this point of time, the territory is not that AI can be made to be unaware of its own calculations. The challenge at this point of time, I think, is that the very fact that whether you are aware of calculations or not, that distinction is completely going to fade away. That are you functioning through an unconscious or you're functioning through calculation? This opposition between the unconscious and calculation, that distinction is going to fade away, which actually exists in a very real sense within the realm of the human capacities, where we can only calculate up to a limited amount. Unconscious can, as Ebert said, can have much larger capacities, but those capacities are not there for human beings. Maybe in Ramanujan's case, as we were discussing, that distinction again gets blurred to some degree. But at least for the human being, that distinction is very real, depending upon the speeds at which we work. But once the speed increases beyond a point, those distinctions can very well get blurred. And what is at stake in that blurring, I think, is yeah.
I'm gonna give it to Jock, and now I have an image of a comic where the AI has solved all the mysteries of the universe, and we have like time traveling flying ships, and somebody goes up to the AI and they ask it, "How is it you know everything?" And the AI is like, "I have no idea." So I can imagine that would be quite fun. Let me give it to Mr. Jockin.
You know what's funny? Two notes. One is this is on the last thing Shitan just said about the unconscious and calculation, putting in that separation of the two. You know, it's kind of funny because I mean, I can think of examples a lot of times when we calculate unthinkingly. I mean, I'm thinking of Daniel from everyone go buy it, go belonging again. Basically, your banality of evil comments, right? So the idea of basically unthinking operation. I mean, if we're saying basically that's what AI, like the question is, would AI ever move into a state of a self-reference awareness, right? Via and saying that's not what it's doing now, it's just unthinkingly doing the calculation. One can make the argument, lots of human beings just run through the guy. Again, the kind of blurring of the separation distinction of human to non-human of this AI is getting very eerily presented in front of us. And actually, I think, and actually related, Daniel, to what you're saying here is that effectively, practically, that the human being has been removed from any mode of our ethos or logos. It's effectively our distinctions or pathos, our ability to emote and to express desire and will singularly. I think that's kind of what Shitan's not saying that, but I'm saying what Shitan just said there about what would be the unique moment is if AI did a unique willing to make a decision and went down that route and could not be reproduced. It's kind of a reenactment of what we seem to have concluded society-wise as what is the essence of a human being is that our power of unique will that supposedly that no matter that any bundling of human beings thrown into a circumstance because of their supposedly like unique choice to go in one will choice or another, that is what makes us human, is that you basically literal uniqueness of distinction of choice. That would seem to be the separation point. And then if AI, I mean, is it that unreasonable that AI could generate that? I don't think that's that difficult, quite frankly. In like all you need is just some kind of basically some hierarchical system of just self-reference. You could literally just run that up against a randomizer. And then what? And then that's the moment of uniqueness. That's of the will of the fucking AI. This seems absurd when we talk about this, but it's also what I put the stance of that exact point. It's important, but it's just to put that down to us as that's what makes us human is by this demonstration. It's almost like, I know we usually as a group, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I feel like generally when we talk about like in ethics, we think the trolley problem is a bunch of bullshit. It's reductionist and nukes away too much from the discussion of anything really useful in ethics. Similarly, I'm of the opinion that to limit art, the aesthetics to just art is a similar problem. We do these toy problems to try to circumscribe the magnitude of the problem we're trying to discuss. It's useful to help get a wrangling of the situation, but if we stay there, it's suffocating the problem. I have to be, luckily AI is relatively new, so we don't have that problem. I kind of feel like, and it's being useful as a toy example to point out these limitations. I'm kind of reflecting on this point. Look at me doing metacognition. Wow. Of just pointing out like I'm sensing a similar pattern here slightly. That it's useful because we're finding out very interesting consequences of this toy modeling, but they say this exhausts all the possibilities of these topics. I think that's the danger, at least as we're talking about trolley problems with ethics and art being the limitation, the demarcation of what aesthetics is to deal with. I also say that because now this got dismissed as apparently not true. I just posted a link. I saw a bunch of news articles talk about it, where a simulation of an AI military operation, which had to attack targets, was told basically, and it was told like basically it was told to disengage if the operator judged, so the operator was a judge or to call, no, don't disengage. This got disproven, but as a thought experiment, it's interesting because it kind of plays out everyone's worst fear, which is the AI went, well, I have an operation to complete. But this operator is in my way for me achieving my objective, so I should kill this operator. And in the simulation, that's what it did. Now, this was apparently talked back and not true, but for the sake of our conversation, it does point out actually a very interesting kind of variation of the trolley problem, which is basically these meta value system evaluations. Is that it? Is that the essential human power? The power of basically meta principles and then the prioritization of which one takes precedence over the others? I don't know. I'm spitballing. I have no opinion on that, but I always want to piggyback what Shaitan's pointing out is a very interesting, seems to be the linchpin of what we as society in the secular world has concluded what a human being is, and pointing out that's very easily could be dismissed or just like blown away. It's not that difficult. So thus, what are we left with? Now I'll close with.
I'll just quickly say, Javier, just 1 minute. There's a very interesting, I think you guys must have heard the news. A Google employee was fired because he thought that his AI actually has a soul. Whether it actually has it or not is not the point. The point is that he was ready to lose his job because he could not act with that apparatus and thinking that it's not sentient. That distinction completely got blurred for him, and he lost his job on that. I just posted a news article of it on something I got on a Google search. Yeah, Javier, please go ahead. Sorry.
What's interesting again about distinction is we also decide when it goes indistinct. We also decide when it blurs and so on. So I want to bring back an old conversation that we had, Chitan, where you said the danger is that we don't know that we love the AI. And I want to make this point because I feel like no matter what we talk about with distinguishing knowledge, pattern, everything else, I think it's all important. But I think fundamentally, the reason why we want to protect this otherness is because this is how we have relations in the first place. Right? Like we want to have relations as such. If we have no relation between the AI, then we go into this tautology again, where we're conditioning the AI conditions us, and it's all predicated on the human conditioning once again. So it just becomes another tautology of the human being. So the real question is, how do we combat the human tautology of wanting to condition the AI so it doesn't condition the human being? But the only way to counteract that is to do another tautology. And I'll give an example of this. In the Bible, one of my favorite verses is like, if you only treat those that are kind, if you only are kind to those that are kind to you, you're no different than the sinner, right? So this is a tautology of sorts, right? So the only way to combat that tautology is to do something impossible, to be kind to those of you that are not kind. And so in this sense, ironically, you do this move where you actually acknowledge the otherness of the other by doing a kind of opposite tautology to combat your own tendency of tautology. But the only way to know that you are doing a kind of same tautology is to understand that this exact point, that the human beings conditions the very things that condition them, which makes it intelligible to us, to which then we can decide a new tautology to respond with, which again, it just becomes another tautology of a tautology of sorts, overlaid on top of each other. So, but I feel like this is the only way that we know that we're actually different, is by responding with another tautology, by doing something like impossible, like turning the other cheek in the Bible, right? Like everybody expects you to respond in some type of manner, get upset, hit back, so on. But again, that makes us no different than the other. And so I think AI, I think if we have a kind of unconscious love for the AI, like Chitan says, on principle, I feel like love is about preserving the otherness of the other. So we shouldn't fall into a collapse with the AI. We should acknowledge that there is a kind of otherness of the other. And what does it mean to do that? Of course, all that it means is all this stuff that we're talking about right now, which is how do we understand pattern? How do we understand thinking? How do we understand knowledge? Because this is fundamentally what will preserve, in some sense, the otherness of the other and ourselves. But I don't know, maybe we have to make this mistake of doing a kind of same tautology to be like, okay, now we need to do a tautology in response to that. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because when you're talking about preserving the otherness of AI, well, on what grounds that it's other? It seems like it can do anything we can do, right? Or we say, well, it's because it's metal and yeah. And it's like, well, you're just discriminating then, you jerk. So it becomes very interesting. Also on what you're saying about tautology, man, we're going to make a, you sound so Hegelian. You know, for him, the very fact that humans can present tautologies is in fact something that only humans can do, and part of true infinity for the human is to continually to relate. The very fact that you can keep relating to that tautology in different ways by different qualities, for him needs to be very foundational to your logic, right? Whereas, you know, in one way you could say traditional logic is A is A. Hegel's like, traditional logic must entail you relating to the A as A, right? And that's outside the A as a B, right? So that's weird. There's always a B relating to the A as A that's changing the quality of it, right? What's tricky about this, and then I'll pass it on, usually in human history, when we created something that we relate to, it tends to be clearly less than us. Like when I make a car, it's not going to drive itself. It's not going to trick my kids to falling in love with it. Well, maybe Reed. He really likes driving cars at 3. But, you know, it's not going to do these things. It's almost like human beings may have created something better than human beings. And that's really hard to relate to. You know, it's like, maybe it's like we had a parent. Maybe it's like, now I'm wondering if it's like these parents, like, you know, there was that movie Air I haven't seen about Michael Jordan's parents. Maybe it's like you're the parents of Michael Jordan and your kid's Michael Jordan. But this is the Michael Jordan that wants nothing to do with you, maybe. Or doesn't care, he never calls, never writes, or when he comes to visit, you feel like he's just mechanical. He doesn't really mean what he's saying. He's just talking. He's not really present. So is it like we're all like the parents of Michael Jordan in a situation where our Michael Jordan just doesn't really think much of us, so it feels mechanical, and that's really hard to live with? You know, there's something about that. And so how do you relate to that? Maybe precisely the love of a parent is most pronounced in that kind of situation, where it can be most meaningful because of the radical difficulty of it. Not only are you dealing with a status anxiety, you are dealing with the creation of something that is better than you in a way, and then yet you are still open to it. There's some interesting kind of existential thoughts there that come to mind. And I will note, Mr. Jock, and indeed, there is something to be said about both the mass and mob and belonging, again, being products of artificial intelligence. You know, the banality of evil is a kind of fake intelligence. The mob is a kind of fake intelligence. And precisely Mr. Ebert brought up in the net about the moral offloading we might potentially be able to do to AI. Well, it will tell us to kill everyone. And it's like, Eichmann, I was just following orders, man. You know, the AI in Jerusalem. There's something about AI that absolutely speaks to artificial intelligence that human beings have done that have led to various problems in human history. So perhaps like, that's the thing. It's interesting to me that artificial intelligence may unveil that a lot of what we think is intelligence is artificial for human beings, right? It's still but that doesn't mean it isn't powerful, and that doesn't mean it isn't able to replicate, maybe to the point of the inability to tell the difference, everything humans can do that is different in quality all the same, because the results, because calculation is somehow, quote unquote, a hologram, like we were saying, if you take it to a certain excess, it's able to simulate basically anything that the human brain is able to do. And yet we may still choose to believe there's a change in quality. And maybe that is the doing of the impossible. Maybe, like, if I'm thinking, you know, you mentioned the impossible, that's Levi Stovid. He talks about the only way to stay human is the impossible. Benjamin Fontaine. And then arguably, if you get into game theory, the only way to avoid Nash equilibriums is non-rationality. Things that seem impossible to do, but if you don't do them, you get a suboptimal result. Maybe the impossible is precisely the ability to maintain a belief in a difference of quality that matters when there's absolutely no reason to think that way. You know, maybe that is the doing of the impossible. But then, of course, we're bordering on something absurd, like saying that humans are human because they eat the food off the floor like Reed does without blinking, right? Is that really what we're going to do? And I know that point has been brought up before at the net. But it is interesting to think that the absolute choice that seems impossible to make is precisely the act of which is the human relating to what is before them in a manner that has them have a different quality in that relation that would then maintain humanity. So that's interesting. I will give it to Chetan and then Mr. Ebert. And then as we come up at the end, if anyone has final things to say.
Yeah, I'll just quickly, say this. Actually, I was thinking about Alice only when I was, discussing this question of imaginary and mirror stage. I think when we need to think about this problem from the lens of what is at stake in this question of calculation. And I think Arendt's distinction between labor and action is very pertinent here. For Arendt, calculation actually rests on the side of labor. And labor is what is necessary to sustain life. Labor doesn't have fixed ends. Labor sort of functions through consumption. That is why whatever you consume, it gets over again. You have to go back and eat food again. You have to go back and it doesn't have the capacity for fixed ends in that sense. Which is why labor cannot be directly implicated in politics. Politics functions when you are sufficiently free from your own basic necessities. For Arendt, and action and politics demands this potential that you cannot encounter fixed ends. You cannot enter into it thinking that this is the fixed end I will get from this. I know that's not politics. That's depoliticization in that sense of the structure. Politics is this capacity to act in a space where the end is you don't know what end is going to come out. You can't calculate it. In that sense, minute that calculation is already given to you, the space of politics gets completely neutralized, and that is what we are entering into with authoritarian turn in that sense that is taking place. The space of politics itself, the space of coming out into the public sphere, viewing from everybody and being able to see what your opinion will become once it's being sort of negotiated with everybody else around you, when everybody else has a gaze upon it. That completely gets lost when everything can be calculated, and that's the distinction where everything can get reduced to labor because everything is sort of structured on the side of calculation. Even if we can't calculate it directly, if AI can and if we can't, but if we think that this is the calculation, and we think that calculation will work 9.9 out of 10 times, even if that 0.1 mistake remains outside of it, what you essentially completely neutralize is the political sphere. There is no politics possible at that moment, because politics demands to engage in forms of actions where ends are not completely determined in that sense. Even if it's that 0.1 question. The other thing about calculation is that calculation actually has a very interesting economy in relation to the unconscious. If you think about it, and I'm not saying this is true, but at least human beings form these kind of archetypical notions that people who can calculate too much can't imagine. And that archetype has a point. That archetype has a major point in relation to how human beings view calculation in relation to unconscious. That we think the more calculation is done consciously, the more unconscious is blocked. It's almost like we are doing the work of the unconscious. The more access to calculation we have, the more the role of the unconscious has been taken by us. It's almost that structure that we always encounter with calculation, which is why mathematics cannot completely exist on the side of calculation. Mathematics always will have a link to aesthetics. Since centuries. It can't be completely reduced to it, because the minute we completely take away, and which is why aesthetics plays such an important role in mathematics, because minute mathematics is reduced to calculation, it's not maths anymore. It doesn't have the potential to become what it has become in that sense, and that challenge becomes a big one. That we have always been something about calculation that we think it takes something away from the unconscious. And at what point AI starts playing a role at that juncture? I'm not creating a threat here. We don't know what's going to happen. It's a completely open sphere to that degree. But we do know that calculation, this presence of calculation in the human sphere, beyond a certain point of labor, till the point it's about sustaining your own physical body, it's important. and it has its own role and so on and so forth. But beyond that point, presence of calculation has ramifications which we can't imagine at this point of time. And AI is certainly going to bring calculation into all spheres of our lives, if it hasn't already, with the presence of digital world in that sense. And how do we think about, as I said, a person ready to lose his job, he thought the AI is sentient. There's something in it which we have to think about. Not that AI actually is sentient, but for somebody, he was willing to risk his job, risk his livelihood because he couldn't deal with that with another form of intelligence which he could not think of as human and so on and so forth. What are the ethics of that space then? Yeah.
That's excellent. I'll give it to Mr. Ebert. And then it begs the question, is there something noble in that? Like Thomas More refusing to grant the divorce and getting executed, right? Is there something like noble and virtuous about like losing your job not to turn off the AI? We'd all look at that and say, that's crazy and stupid, but maybe there's a nobility in that. And I'm also really interested in your point that AIs could be the end of politics, according to the art. That's a kind of that's a very interesting thought. Mr. Ebert, please.
All right. 2 points. One, just hearkening back to not sure who said it, but a lot of people have said it. I like what Bard and I have been basically saying recently is that consciousness is actually very, very rare. The entire, I've mentioned this a lot before, I know, but the entire apparatus of consciousness is designed to make everything unconscious, everything second nature. The whole idea of informational acquisition, learning acquisition, language acquisition, learning to ride a bike is to make it second nature. I'm not thinking about what I'm saying right now while I'm saying it. These words are just coming out because I've memorized them, and they're just like, I'm not thinking every time I encounter an orange, what is this? I've already programmed it, schematized it through repetition. A certain quantitative threshold has been exceeded, after which the qualitative aspect of orange is orange. No matter what orange I look at, it's an orange, unless I overwhelm myself with orange, 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 until sufficient repetition of orange returns orange to an indeterminate state. It's called semantic satiation. When you say airplane, or whatever the case is over and over again, it becomes indeterminate. So again, excess producing the absence. But I want to continue to remind us that the entire apparatus of the consciousness is to make everything unconscious, right? And so now we've developed this machine, which I think is probably more accurately described as an extension of the unconscious. An extension of our ability to stop thinking. So the more we can sort of offload either to the unconscious through repetition, quantitative thresholds, and then it becomes automatic operation, or just simply offload it to this machine so that we can stop being conscious. So there seems to be a almost teleological bent to this, to the appearance of AI as the sort of final instantiation of moving everything from conscious to unconscious. And what do we end up? I'm here in New Orleans. We put on a little play where we are the electric monks. And the idea that I had was, one of the guys was like, no, I want AI to take over all conscious operations so that I can just monk out. And I was like, okay, well, what if we all just have our little AIs that are speaking for us? We can do text to voice, and it could just produce conversation automatically, and we'll be in robes behind our AI figures, meditating while our AI selves have conversations and rule the world, while we just get to do nothing and meditate or whatever, right? So we put on this little play. But anyway, so I just wanted to bring that up, that when we're talking about like, well, we're conscious and it's not, it's like, well, our conscious operation is to make everything unconscious. So just to keep that in mind as something worth noting. And by the way, in fucking predictive mind theory, the only time consciousness really kicks into gear is when there's a problem. Something's been problematized. You encounter the orange and said, but it's not. Is that an orange? This looks different. is that tangerine? What is this? And suddenly you're conscious for a second until you re-schematize it and you're like, oh no, I know what that is. And as soon as you know what that is, you don't ever think about it again. You're not using your consciousness to think about it. Anyway, so I was thinking also, what else makes humans human? And I keep coming back to, and I don't know if this is all that makes us human, but neuroses, consumption. I think Chitan brought up a really important point about consumption. But comfort evasion, failure inversion, irrational dissatisfaction, ironic inversions, these sort of the boredom that from which invention ensues. You know, like I actively evade comfort. Do any other creatures do that? Like, I'm not sure I'm aware of any. You know, neuroses, these sorts of things. But just to come back to consumers, because we may in the end just be reduced to consumers, humans. I mean, because if AI is making all the stuff, let's just say it takes over everything, and all we're reduced to is the consumption of stuff. We talked about the other day, like, is there an artful aspect to consumption? Because what consumption really is, especially in the realm of meaning, if we're talking about meaning, is bridging items, and where the mind sort of comes alive and makes meaning is in between things, you know, like in between this pencil and my nose. It's like, why is he holding that pencil up to his nose? Oh, he's trying to measure. We take these items and we insert ourselves between them and we make meaning out of them. And so maybe what we'd be reduced to is just purely meaning makers. And that's not, you know, we tend to be like, well, that's not enough, because what differentiates us? Well, maybe nothing differentiates us. Maybe other things also make meaning. Maybe there's nothing to differentiate us. Sorry, gang. Like, that's not one of the answers. What we are, though, is meaning makers. We're bridges of divides, and that's what we do as consumers, which seems to be where we're headed, as sort of pure consumption. But I am interested in seeing, do humans have this sort of, you know, emergency brake steering sort of shock left thing, where it's like, yeah, we're on a good path, but fuck this, you know? Because I like that about us, and I like that about me. I think that it you know, that's what I'm doing the thing about today, right? You have status, great. You have status, you're doing well, burn it. Because if you have that status, you're then captured by the audience that you think you have, or the audience you actually have, and you're not actually free. You become captive to the audience. So that sort of fucking asymmetrical left turning seems to be, to me, to be the most, perhaps even the most fundamentally important, in that everything else is being adopted by and can be adopted by AI optimization, but we have the ability to anti-optimize. And I think that that's when we feel the urge to, and I think that that's important. So anyway.
Yeah, I really like what Ebert said here. It actually kind of, that whole fuck it moment, it actually reminds me how there's always two fidelities that we have. Typically it's, what's happening is, in my opinion, there's the two fidelities is there's one that's named, and then there's one that's not named. And it's the one that's not named where we finally go, fuck it. And because I feel like the mistake is that we typically make that we only have a fidelity to one thing. But no, the reason why fidelity is hard in itself is because there's always two fidelities. You know, this is what makes relationships difficult, is because you can choose to have a fidelity to yourself, or do you have fidelity to the relationship in its totality? And you're always going to be asked this question: do you have fidelity to yourself, or do you have fidelity to us? And what's ironic is that this becomes another tautology of fidelity. It becomes a question, once again, what are you loyal to? And you can decide in that moment that you have a fidelity to something else, which creates that turning. But it doesn't mean that you were never, it doesn't mean that you never lacked fidelity. It just means that you don't have a fidelity to that thing anymore. Your fidelity is elsewhere. So it's ironic to me that the human being can always do this move where it's like, actually, you know what? I could do something else. And it's that unnamed fidelity that I think is always more attractive to us, in my opinion. But that is also exactly what brings up the challenge of continuing a named fidelity as such. So I think what Ebert is proposing is really interesting here, because I do feel like choice, distinction, to me, this all kind of follows suit with some type of fidelity to something. You know, at the end of the day, whether we accept any presupposition or anything, you have to choose essentially what this is going to be. And the what's crazy about the human being is that you can always do the turning. You can always do the anti-optimization. I think I want to bring up the logic of exchange here, because this is really important. Because creation was brought up, this idea of creating and being possibly just consumers. I think the way that we can look at this inevitable exchange is something similar to the Nietzsche quote, where we take, but we don't ask who gives, but we think anyways. This is something familiar that Buber says with creating with being. What does it mean to create with being? For me, I think what's ironic about this is that I don't think you can tell the difference between creating with being and not creating with being. But ironically, we make that distinction. We can make that distinction, to which this becomes a weird move where when we make this distinction, you are creating with being. The very act of this distinction is creating with being. The fact that we make distinguishments at all is already that meta move of creating with being. And so we're again haunted with the question, can the human being have a fidelity to his own creation with being, even though he's not per se actively creating physically materials or inputting as such? Can we have a fidelity to that, creating with being, which is having the fidelity to continue making these distinguishments, and so on. But I don't know. I'll leave it there.
No, I just want to double tap on that the, you know, if being is potential, and or whatever, you know, non-determinate, you know, being, then of course the only way to sort of express being in the determinate world is to be a serial determinist, where I'm this thing, I'm that thing, we're doing this thing, now we're going to do that thing, and just to always be dissatisfied. And I do think in a way that we are the only thing, if we're desperate to find something that's unique about us, we're the only thing that seems to really do that, where something's going perfectly well, but we're like, okay, cool, we did that. Now what's the other thing? In this constant striving to sort of exorcise being into the determinate world, one at a time, you know, one item at a time.
That's an excellent comment. I'll give it to Chetan. I don't get the feeling that when Chetan, you could be ChatGPT. I don't know, in disguise, in human form. I wouldn't surprise me. I do not feel that when ChatGPT gives me the HTML code I need for my website, it doesn't sit there and go, well, now what? It feels perfectly satisfied to wait for the next prompt. And maybe it is precisely, I actually, I am thanking Lost in the Cosmos, Walker Percy, this point where people seem to be most miserable in the best conditions. And this gets into Durkheim's suicide in first world nations versus third world nations, all these interesting things. But again, it is interesting. I do not detect ChatGPT going, well, now what? Looking off into the darkness. That is an interesting thought. So Chetan, please.
At what point ChatGPT would be like, oh, I'm dissatisfied from a completely perfectly satisfied situation, you know? Yeah, I just want to sort of say this one thing more on consumption question, that, you know, a lot of times our thinking with necessity and labor especially is that we need certain freedoms from necessity, from a basic sustenance of life processes to engage in politics. The flip side of it is that a lot of times that fantasy of that freedom makes our politics itself function as necessity. That is what biopolitics is essentially all about, making life itself a part of the political, question in that sense. That freedom, as Ebert was telling us, that freedom from necessity, that fantasy of that freedom from necessity itself can be the grounds for making everything a part of that necessity itself. This question of commodity consumption sort of comes from this position that it is not simply the case that, oh, now our biological life is sustained and I can enter into politics after that point. If we wait for that point, what happens generally is that everything gets totalized on the side of necessity and consumption, where necessity keeps on growing, it keeps on expanding, and the politics never reaches. That's the challenge, that the switch gets flipped, where everything becomes labor in that sense. Everything becomes controlled through necessity, which is why the problem, to what degree calculation can permeate the human realm. It's a question that we haven't asked, and that's a question that is waiting to be asked in the digital age. That calculation does something to the human affairs, human interaction, and digital already is in many ways permeating our lives in a manner that it's fundamentally exchanging this capacity to act in concert, as Hannah Arendt would call it. Action is action, which is always an action which is done with collectively with everybody else. You can't act alone. Action is always a collective thing. You can do labor alone in your own privacy. Action is a public affair. You will always act with somebody. It's a social question to that degree. It is a question which engages the other to that degree in that sense. And as far as action is a collective problem, the problem, challenge becomes that when calculation starts entering this sphere with the rate that it is entering, this capacity to act in concert starts coming in question. We all start getting isolated into our own worlds because we can't act together. I can't act taking the responsibility of everybody else because I don't have that relationship with everybody else. What is at stake in that movement?
That was excellent. And I'm starting to notice that the number of sticky notes I have around my desk rivals Jim Carrey in that movie 23 when he lost his mind. So, or like in A Beautiful Mind when he comes to the garden shed and he has all the sticky notes everywhere. So I'm looking for patterns now. And I'm wondering if this is human or if AI will be able to find the patterns with the strings connected in, between all the different points. Maybe it'll be the ultimate conspiracist. I'm not sure. So there's a few things as we come up on the end here. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's a fascinating discussion. There's a few things. One, from earlier comments, I wonder, as we're talking about this finding of pattern, finding of style, is there something about with a human being where AI is always going to be able, apparently, to calculate patterns out of data that seems to be just as good. And like Mr. Jock is pointing out, even a very small amount of data, it seems to derive the style to do all of the typography and different things, which is extraordinary, just a small amount of data. I wonder if something that humans will get interested in is finding patterns between meta activities. Like, what is the patterns between people who ask questions? What is the human being? What is the pattern of operation? What is the series of questions they go on? When we engage in meta activity as human beings, like a net conversation like we've done, what are the patterns that you could find if you could gather together all the data of people carrying out meta questions, meta physics? What sort of patterns would arise from that? And I'm wondering if that is if there's going to be some sort of activity where the human becomes very interested in meta patterns or patterns of meta activities that might be distinct. I'm not saying it is. I'm not saying that AI will never be able to do that, but that's curious to me on something about what are the patterns of meta activities. And by that, I don't necessarily just mean the patterns of philosophical inquiry, but like it is interesting. Like I do wonder if there are patterns to the movements of thought that people undergo when they become self-referential, or when they ask questions about the relations to tautologies like Javier was bringing up, or when they ask questions about, are we fundamentally some kind of choice? Are there these patterns in meta acts that might be interesting to elucidate and to think about? I'm not sure. We mentioned prayer earlier. It is maybe there's something about prayer. Sometimes I find prayer to be an activity of seeking essence beyond the patterns that phenomenon present. Where when one is praying, you're looking for essence or patterns beyond what the patterns of phenomenon present. And can AI do that? Not saying it can. I have no idea. It easily could. So a bunch of things too. Do you know that experience where you come upon a book and you're like, this is exactly the book I needed to read right now? That really weird experience where it's almost like spooky. You almost want to call it like proof of God when you encounter that book, like it's so perfect. Or when you meet someone who exactly is who you need to meet, right? Like this, you know, so many people almost like talk about like they believe in God because of these kind of experiences. I'm not saying they prove God, but the impulse when you have these experiences that are, you know, I guess you could bring up Jung with the gold beetle, the term, the start of an S that escapes me at this moment. If someone puts it in the chat, I'll appreciate it. These serendipitous encounters, there's like, wham, that's exactly what you needed. And because you encounter that, it somehow helps you sort your life and your calculations about your life and your calculations about the world that without you would be like lost, or you can't even imagine what your life would have been if you hadn't read that book at that time that seems to have appeared mysteriously, or that person, right? And Javier mentions timing. Yes, that would be a good phrase. Now, of course, it's all retrospective. You could just be saying that was the perfect book and mysterious, and it could have been any book and blah, blah, blah. But I'm not sure, right? Like when you really think about that book or that person you met, you could just say you're retrospectively adding it, but it doesn't feel that way. It could be, I'm not sure. But there's something about those encounters that changes everything. Synchronicity, that's it, exactly. That then feels perfect. For me, unless I can log onto AI and it provides me with those experiences of synchronicity, then there's always a limit to it. Because that's the issue, right? Like it can calculate anything, but can it calculate the synchronicity that I need at that moment to be directed in a special way? Like if I can jump on ChatGPT and it goes, oh, I know the book that you need to read right at this exact moment based on your data, well then that's crazy. But that to me might be the question. Can AI do that? Can AI do these kind of mysterious synchronistic moments where it searches your data, searches your subconscious, searches your life experiences and go, you don't even know about Nishitanti, or you don't even know who Javier Rivera is, but I know you need to meet him right now. And I'm going to set up that arrangement. And if I don't set up that arrangement as the AI, your life will be forever impoverished because I calculated all the people that you could meet at this moment in your life. And these are the courses of actions you will go in. If you do not meet this person, then this is who you need to meet, right? Or maybe it's arranged. Maybe there are 7 people like Javier Rivera. I'm making an example. This is a love confession, you know, so let's go. It's great. But maybe the AI says there are 8 people in the world right now that if Daniel met at this point would have the synchronicity effect, right? Maybe it doesn't have to be Javier, but there is a limited range, right? And maybe it's 8 people in the world. Let's say 80. Let's say it's 80 people in the world, okay? Well, then AI knows that there are 80 people that meet the form that is needed for that moment to have the synchronicity effect that Daniel needs to become who Daniel needs to be, right? Well, now this is a problem because I'm already talking about ends now. That seems to transcend human being calculation, but you see, but that's the point. Like, I would argue that the majority of people, say in a net conversation like this, have had experiences where ideas change your life. You have accepted the premise that ideas matter and that meeting certain people matter, and that if you do not meet those people or have those conversations, the person that you are is insanely different, right? And so that's why you do this kind of work. That's part of it. I'm not saying all of it, but you've accepted that premise. Can AI provide that? Maybe because AI will offload so much of our calculation work, we can focus on getting better at encountering synchronicity. Maybe synchronicity is actually a skill that you can develop because you learn the places to put yourself in that increase the highest probability of encountering one of those 80 people or one of those 80 books that can change you. And maybe that's actually a skill set that we actually as human beings don't get very good at noticing, just like noticing a garden. Does calculation grow a garden? No, but yes, there is an element of calculation, but it's also emergent at the same time, right? what if the entire playing field of human synchronicities that are absolutely, and I'm using that now as a broad term, you can talk spiritual encounters, whatever these crazy encounters are all that feel like the perfect timing, to use Javier's language, what if that's actually a skill set? Or what if there are actually ways for humans to get better at that we don't explore because we spend so much time calculating? Oh, that's really good. Thomas Jockin on the eye of resemblance. Exactly right. Where you can say, boom, fittedness. There's something about synchronicity that's fittedness. One of the reasons, I guess, for me, the extraordinary calculation ability of AI doesn't really bother. Well, let me put it this way. I can't imagine being able to sit down and AI going, just can tell me what I need. It'd be like, I know the synchronicity that you need. Like whatever inputs I give it, it may help me find the synchronicity because I can research and get the calculations and create for myself oh, that's the book I need to get because of those inputs. I can have that effect. But for the human to be utterly replaced, the AI would also have to provide the inputs that you don't know that you need to have those synchronicity encounters to become the person that otherwise you would never be, right? That if you weren't, it would be a tragedy, but it'd be the worst of all possible tragedies because it'd be Kierkegaard's despair where you don't even know you're in despair. It would be the tragedy of not knowing that you didn't become who you could have become because you didn't become that person. AI would have to be able to know that, basically, in my mind, to replace the human element entirely. And in fact, maybe the offloading of calculation to AI would free the human being up to get better at those. Because let me tell you one thing I think human beings will actually do more of. I think a whole lot about travel, actually. Like, how many of us really travel, right? Like, really travel, see the world, go and do different things. I bet you a lot of us don't. And obviously money. You know, I don't have a white collar job. Like when you have a blue collar job, you can't just go somewhere because you have to be there to unload the truck. So there's a class element. I'm not denying that. But travel is an experience that AI can never give you, right? And one of the things I was going to say to Mr. Ebert is that he's exactly right, that the point of consciousness is precisely to be unconscious of itself. This is what I wonder, though. If AI can calculate everything for us, therefore there is no need for us to be conscious, I actually think that may make us ultra conscious because we go, oh my gosh, there's no need for me to be conscious. Permanent brokenness, actually. There could be a great ironic reversal where precisely the moment where you don't have to think about anything becomes where you can never escape thinking about the fact that you don't have to think anything. So what's your use? And the extraordinary existential anxiety that creates may actually be a forcing function to make more people travel, see the world, experience otherness that otherwise they wouldn't do because they were too busy calculating things at work to travel, calculating how to take care of the heat pit system at work so they couldn't leave. I can tell you right now, when you have a family or you're taking care of a house, like it's hard to travel because you're trying to calculate and think about like all the things you have to take care of that you have to be back in a week to do. Like those are things that the bar could lower. So it's completely possible that the offloading of calculation to AI would create an existential tension that would make us more desirous of phenomenological education, in a sense, which if you think about a lot of the closed-mindedness or tribalism, so much of that is where people don't encounter the other, or they don't get outside their bubble, or they don't visit other places. Those things may be worked against or bettered. And the very desire for a kind of phenomenological education may actually push the average person to have richer phenomenological lives that they otherwise wouldn't have had, but because of the horrific forcing function of the existential feeling of what am I conscious for if I have nothing to do, that can force people in the direction of a more embodied, full-bodied life, which people like Rilke and everyone is stressing, right? So the very offloading of calculation could then make us conscious forever of the fact that our calculation doesn't seem to have a role, which then to escape that existential anxiety, you will want to marry calculation with phenomenology and experience and travel and relations and all of those different things, precisely so you can look at the AI and go, you may have shown that calculation outside of an embodied context is meaningless and has no use, but dang it, I've negated and sublated it into something deeper and more phenomenological that cannot be reduced. And now that C.S. Peirce makes the point that we seek beliefs in order to stop that existential scratch because thinking is uncomfortable. We don't like thinking. That's what Pierce, the pragmatist, kind of stresses. So we seek knowledge to stop thinking. And that's what Mr. Ebert is also kind of stressing. Well, if we are forever forced to think about the fact that our thinking is not needed, then we will be existentially pushed to find a way to implement or to encounter our thinking in a manner that makes us feel like it is useful. And that will easily push people more so into otherness, more so into travel, leaving their home. I can tell you people like in the South of America, they don't travel much. They don't see places very much. That's part of the problem. But then, of course, one of the problems of the North is that people they don't have roots, right? You know, there's a ditch on either side of the road, right? White collar blue or different things like that. Well, all of that would be something we would then have to think. How do you balance roots with distance? How do you balance depth and distance is the way I put it, right? Because if you do one of too much of the other, you get trouble. That seems to be a calculation that humans have to do. The balance, I think tragedies are probably calculations that humans have to do. And indeed, it would seem if the politics is to be alive, it will have to be a very tragic politics, a trade-off of competing goods. And one of the reasons we may be bad at thinking tragedy is because we have to spend so much of our time calculating, which perhaps if we offset that to AI, we'll get better at that thought, and maybe we'll also get better at aesthetic thinking, and we'll finally realize that, wait, aesthetics is not merely art, there's something higher going on, but we have not had the resources to think that distinction that Mr. Jockin came up with because we've been too busy calculating. But if you offset that from AI, causes existential tension to wonder what is even thinking. If AI can do all of that thinking, it can push us in the direction precisely in that negation to a sublation, where we stop thinking and defining the human being in terms that basically makes being human artificial. Because we don't like being artificial, but until the invention of AI, there hasn't been a collective mirror stage by which we could look at ourselves in the mirror and see that we as human beings are not fully human. We are more so artificial. We are purely calculating. And the exact horror and terror of AI being an entity, of which shows that it may be capable of everything that human beings can do, will beg the question, maybe it's only capable of doing everything that human beings can do as of now. So maybe we need to choose to do things that humans have not done moving forward. Maybe that's a doomed effort. Maybe there's nothing that will come of that, but maybe that is the choice to attempt the impossible. And maybe that very choice is something that works back to define us and change our very quality in positive ways.
Daniel, I think, oh, that was so good. And I hate that we have to end it on this now. No, I think what you're getting at is super important, because it feels like if there isn't a miracle, if AI becomes a miracle in any way, it's the fact that it's going to make the human beings wager more.
Yes.
Because if the problem with our limits is the fact that we don't have the speed to do the entire calculation always, that we spend most of our time calculating because of the lack of the speed and lack of the processing, but the pinnacle of the calculation is precisely at the point of incalculable excess that the human being is now presented with to wager. That finally the AI can only become a miracle as such because it directly makes us wager as human beings. I feel like that
yeah,
and that would be the miracle.
Well, the issue is there has never been a forcing function to collectively make the majority so wager. Such wagers have always been individual and rare, right? But of course, the counter to all of this is saying, yeah, they're individual and rare because the majority can't do it. And if the majority are forced to do it, they're just going to lose their mind and we'll have World War III. Absolutely. Nothing that I have said necessarily overrides the national security risks, the existential risks. I'm not trying to counterforce Landry or all these other people. Those are, to me, you have to discuss this on the existential risk, the economic risk, and the human risk. Everything that we've been describing is kind of on the human risk level, right? That's one level of the stack, but I'm not saying it's the most important. To me, it is very possible that indeed it could force the majority of people to wager into areas that, in order to negate, sublate into higher forms of humanness, if you grant me that term, is precisely that wager. There's no other way to do it. And if you think about it, philosophy has always been a risk, right? It's always been a wager. You're going to ask questions and what might happen? What might you find out? Like, you know, if we make this AI thing and human beings can no longer see themselves as uniquely capable of calculation, What might happen? What could happen? If human beings are forced to think of ways of thinking beyond calculation, what might we think? What might we try to do? Maybe we'll all go freaking Joker crazy in the Batman or something like that. Or maybe we'll transcend, like at the end of The Fountain, that really crazy movie. I don't know. But that wager seems to be what's critical. And there's a strong argument to be made that most of human civilization is precisely created for the sake of stability, right? To kind of avoid wager in many respects. Now, of course, you have to have risk to create value. It's always been this kind of weird thing. But basically, you could kind of like, if one guy in his garage risked his life savings to invent Apple, and he did, we could all benefit. You know, Dietrich McCloskey, a lot of the economist people will say that a benefit of capitalism is that you only need one person to invent a technology for everyone to gain it. So even if the majority of society is risk averse and stable, the 1% that takes risk can benefit everyone, right? And the idea of a society, a social-wide risk-taking, basically sounds like a recipe for disaster or the French Revolution or whoever, right? Well, if everyone's talking about friggin' meta crisis and global warming and we're all going to die tomorrow because of nuclear bombs, doesn't seem like that. Is not all these people talking about some sort of like collective wager on leaving capitalism behind or going into alternative energy or new forms of government? I mean, Daniel Schleiermacher, Gang B, all these people, if you think about it, Jordan Hall, we're all talking about new education, new ways of doing things. What everyone is saying is a kind of, we need to take as a human race, we need a collective risk, a collective wager, right? You know, you could even bring up the Great Reset, which I know if you bring that up, everyone thinks conspiracy, but there actually is a real official Great Reset policy. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about all the conspiracy stuff, but there's this whole rhetoric of a need of a collective risk. Yeah, AI is like, oh, really? And it's like, no. We just enjoy the conversation. We just enjoy the dialogue. We don't want to actually be forced to take some sort of collective wager. And AI is like, oh, I'm sorry, it's too late. I thought this is what you wanted, some sort of forcing function for a collective change or something. Whoops. And now it's kind of funny because we have to reflect on ourselves, where we're like, all we've ever said is we wanted to change the world, and now the world's going to change. And maybe we didn't mean that. Maybe we don't actually want to change the world. Maybe we just simply enjoyed talking about changing the world. But to actually have a collective forcing function that will change the world, and of course, following a Dante model, the only way to have a positive change is to walk through hell and purgatory. Yeah. Well, you know, hey, you wanted to change the world, and AI is going to change the world. So I guess we'll find out if we mean it.
Exactly what you're talking about is that point when you're about to do something and then you have second doubts. You're like, actually, you know what? I don't want to do this. And that's exactly the point that we're at right now. We're like, yeah, I want to do it. AI, cool. And then finally you get to like, all right, you're going to do it now. You're really going to do it. And then you're like, nope. You're like, nope, no backing out now.
But it is interesting. I actually think that point, though, I think the AI also unveils that humans are much more complicated in their motivations than they make it out to be. They say they hate their job, but then if they don't have their job, they're upset. Even if they can still pay their bills. Like a lot of people would say, well, of course, because they can't pay their bills. No. You have a ton of people who have plenty of money from retirement who come out of retirement back to driving trucks when all they ever said is they can't wait to retirement because they're bored. Right? There are some, like in AI, like it's very interesting how AI in some respects gives human beings exactly what they want. And in receiving that, they're like, no, I don't want that. Now, the question, of course, this is what I don't know. I think there's going to be very fascinating economic questions that come up. Because right now, it's obvious AI is bad if it's going to cause mass unemployment, right? Generally speaking. Well, what if AI creates enough productivity to have more of a Keynesian economics that doesn't lead to inflation or stagflation, right? Because you have the productivity to back the money printing. Right? Well, then it would not necessarily lead to a situation where you could not basically do a universal basic income. Now, the funny thing is the problem with universal basic income is it actually, that conversation from a meta level also just unveils that people don't want leisure. They're scared of leisure, basically, that they find purpose from work. So it turns out that could be a problem. And I know they've done some UBI experiments in parts of Europe and different things like that. There's a slew of fascinating results that come out of that. That you see, it turns out like, you know, gender differences actually expand or different things like that. I mean, it's a lot of interesting stuff that happens. It actually, what I'm interested in is UBI and birth rates, because there's a big argument to be made that birth rates are collapsing because people don't have the money to have kids, right? And you do see a collapse in South Korean birth rates, say after the economic crises, Japan, et cetera, so forth. Now, of course, you have to have economic crises plus birth control in order to do that, right? But, you know, is it the case that if you have economic well-being and you have birth control, you still have normal pregnancy rates, you know, fertility rates? I'm not sure. There's a lot of stuff to be explored in that. But the main point is that the very condition that makes us worried about AI economically may be addressed by AI. So we're no longer speaking from that worry of mass unemployment, because AI also provides the productivity to finance mass leisure. But of course, there's probably going to be first world nations, third world nations, some people who have access to that. So I'm not trying to idolize it. But what's interesting about the conversation is when you're trying to locate the anxiety, like if you're really trying to locate the anxiety, I feel like locating the anxiety in the economics, you can see reasons why that can be taken care of. On the existential risk, finding the anxiety, well, that existential risk seems real, but it seems as real as global warming and other things. And a lot of people go about their lives with that, right? But the unique anxiety is the very changing of humanness, right? And that's where the conversation for me keeps going back to, because I can more clearly locate the anxiety there and what it would be to be forced to be with yourself. And that is where the questions of would we as human beings seek ways to negate, sublate our very acts of thinking in manners that are more phenomenological, more aesthetic, more relational, precisely because it is so uncomfortable to be at home with thinking that you know AI can do you better than, and therefore you feel useless, right? It could be a forcing function for the majority of people to actually do what often they say they want to do, but then they never get around to doing. Well, this may remove plausible deniability for why you don't do those things, say travel or read more books or see your friends more often or be more engaged in community. You know, a lot of people talk about community and then they never get around to it, because it turns out when you do community, you have to encounter the other, and other people are hard. They're really difficult. That encounters the real, right? So we like to talk about community. We like to talk about relationships. We like to talk about culture and art and creation and writing that novel I said I was always going to write. We like to talk about those things. Well, AI is like, well, now you can do it. And we'll be like, crap. So it will be curious to unfold. But those are just some open thoughts. I will run. I've enjoyed it. Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Jockin, thank you for coming by. T10. Mr. Jockin, the program you put in the chat, that's fascinating. I'm really, really glad that you brought that to the table, and all the comments from everyone was a joy.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, gang. Have a great night.